Economic and financial sanctions against Iran are being debated now by Congress and are also before the United Nations Security Council following the international agreement over Iran's nuclear program. Gary Hufbauer at the Peterson Institute for International Economics has been studying sanctions generally and their effectiveness for 3 decades or more. This is Steve Wiseman at the Peterson Institute in a conversation with Gary to talk about why sanctions seem to have been effective this time. Gary, welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Gary, the first question I have is this the first time that sanctions against Iran have been effective?
No. As a matter of fact, if we go way back in history to 1979, when the Iranians had their revolution and seized more than, I think, almost 100 hostages, American hostages, we put on, that is the United States, put on very strong sanctions. We basically seized all the Iranian assets, which were quite substantial at the time. My recollection is about $10 billion, which was a lot of money in 1980, 1979. And that, in turn, led the Iranian Revolutionary Forces to negotiate with the United States over the release of the hostages. And there are a whole lot of claims going back and forth, U.S. claims against Iran, Iranian claims against U.S. companies. And a whole tribunal system was set up in The Hague. But in any event, having those assets brought that revolutionary government to the negotiating table. And finally, yes, the hostages were released, and the claims over a long period of time were settled. So that was a very successful episode.
Right. So in the years after the hostages were released, as we recall, they were released, I certainly do, on January 20th, 1981, the day of President Reagan's inauguration.
Right.
But in the subsequent decades, there were other sanctions against Iran over terrorism and especially its nuclear program. Those were less effective, apparently.
Yes, we rated them as not being effective. Obviously, terrorism with support of Hezbollah went on, and it's going on to this day. And Iran probably started its nuclear program in the early 90s, and it continued apace, for a good, well, to the present, a good 20 years.
So when did this latest round of sanctions on the nuclear program start to really hurt Iran?
Well,
and why?
Yes, right. Up until about 2010, it was only the U.S. which was imposing sanctions, and they were not very strong sanctions. And Iran had a dedicated interest in pursuing a nuclear weapons program. So the balance wasn't right to get talks going. In 2010, the U.S. really stepped up its sanctions, and it got a coalition of countries, our European allies, but also loosely in that coalition was Russia, or is Russia, and China, which are not normally on the same side as the United States in these matters. And all these countries put on very strong sanctions against Iran, not freezing assets, because Iran by that time didn't have so many assets in the U.S., or none at all, or maybe not so much in some of the other countries, but the U.S. and the other countries did sharply interrupt Iran's oil exports, which are its main source of foreign exchange, probably cutting them in half. And on top of that, really limited Iran's access to the international financial system, the banking network. So it made it very cumbersome for Iran either to buy or sell much of anything. And together, those sanctions have, managed to drag Iran to the negotiating table with the so-called P5+1 and hammer out this deal.
So this is a question I have is, were the sanctions successful because of the coercive ability of the United States using its muscle through its financial system and the access to it? Or was there a certain amount of diplomacy and cooperation that we can say the Obama administration secured with Russia and China.
Yes, I would give the diplomatic aspect a big cheer. This was quite a success for the Obama administration. First of all, the U.S. has never been a big oil importer from Iran, and the oil market is a global market. So without the cooperation of the countries which are oil importers from Iran, the oil part of the deal never would have been successful. That was China, India, Japan, Korea, and Europe. And they really Europe completely eliminated its imports. The others kept their imports. So that was diplomacy right there. And on the finance, yes, it's true. The U.S. is the dominant player in the international financial system. But if only the U.S. had tried to knock out Iranian banks from its financial network, Fedwire, and banking relations, there would have been plenty of other banks in other countries, which are very, respectable banking countries, through which Iran could have done business. And again, it was the diplomacy through the UN and bilateral which persuaded banks elsewhere, in Europe and elsewhere, to respect these financial sanctions.
So my final question then, Gary, is that President Obama is assuring Congress and the world that if Iran fails to adhere to these terms on its nuclear program, the sanctions can be snapped back, the so-called snapback. But I think, but you've written for our website that such an event would be more complicated than perhaps they're acknowledging.
Yes, it would be more complicated. Remember, the UN is going to eliminate the umbrella for sanctions, which is the umbrella under which Russia, China, India, and other countries have participated. So you won't have the umbrella anymore, and it would have to be restored either through the UN or bilaterally. So that's diplomacy, that's work. Each country will have its own judgment as to whether Iran is cheating on the agreement. And we expect that other countries, business firms operating from other countries, will be more eager to do business in Iran than probably U.S. firms. But once they're there, those other business firms will put pressure on their governments to take a very lenient view towards Iran's obligations and whether it's fulfilling as it should do and so forth. All that will make it more difficult, and it's also quite possible that some countries will sign long-term take-or-pay contracts for Iranian oil. And take-or-pay means if you don't take it because you're putting on sanctions, you still are supposed to pay. So, that would be another argument against restoring sanctions. Now, if the price of oil remains very low, it's not such an issue, but let's suppose the price of oil goes back to, $80, $100 a barrel, well, then that would be a big issue for countries which had signed these contracts. So all of that would make the diplomacy of snapback in terms of getting participation of other countries, it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be impossible. It would depend on the extent of Iranian, misbehavior, cheating, and how obvious it was.
Gary, thanks very much. It's very interesting.
Thank you.